Hello, I'm Tatiana Serafin, co-host of the Doorstep podcast here at Carnegie Council. I'll be joined in a moment with my fellow co-host, Nick Gvosdev, and also our special guest returning for the third year in a row, Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review, to help us understand where the world is today in January 2023, what to expect over the next 12 months, and what happened to us last year. As we look at today, January 11th is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day. It is Wear Blue Day. I'm wearing blue for this important issue. We'll be talking more about it in future doorsteps as an important issue in the world. I also want to mention that next week, looking at America in the world today, we will be joined with Christopher McKnight-Nichols to talk about ideology in U.S. foreign relations, our first book talk of 2023. Please go to carnegiecouncil.org to sign up. We look forward to your thoughts and your ideas this year. We're starting a whole new year. Please find us on Twitter for as long as Twitter lasts. Email us at carnegiecouncil.org. Look for our previous podcasts. We want to hear what your issues are for 2023 as we go forward. And let's join our guest and co-host right now. Judah, it is so great to welcome you for year 3 of our What in the World is Going On in the World review. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, Nick, 3 years, 3 different backgrounds. The first one was in the den, the second one in the kitchen, and now what looks like the living room.
Well, just as this is partly the doorstep being on the road, at least one half of it, because we're going to be meeting to discuss with some students at Gettysburg College, seniors that are part of the Solarium program, to be looking at challenges to national security. And they want to get a sense of the doorstep issues that they should be looking at.
Right on.
That is a perfect intro into what should we be looking at this year. Last time we spoke, I went back and I looked at 221 and 222. I had to do it. I had to see if our predictions held together. And I have to say, we are pretty prescient. So in 2021, which we called a groundhog year, we spent a lot of time thinking about how the pandemic was going to shape us. We are now in 2023, and I just gave my daughter a booster yesterday, so we still have the pandemic around. Certainly in China's case, it is still a huge part of their discussion, their doorstep issues, and ours though, because that affects our trade. So we'll talk about that. But what I thought was really interesting from 2021, Judah, you had mentioned that the world and your concern was a splinter net. And I just want to start off talking about tech issues, because I think tech really dominated all of our geopolitical concerns last year. And so I think I'd like to start out with looking at tech and the splinter net that you talked about, and how we go forward when we're looking at how the internet and social media has changed how war is conducted, how the UK is going about regulating Facebook and Europe, how TikTok is now being banned in the US and what's going to happen there. That's not so much of a splinter net, but you did mention also the regulation aspect of social media and what's going to happen. And with social media pervading everything we do, I'd like to talk about the world in 2023 and how it is being shaped with social media. And Judah, how do you see it over on your end? Because there's so much going on where you are. 3 prime ministers in 1 year, ambulance strike.
And a lettuce.
And a lettuce. So how has social media, and what do you think the role of social media will be in 2023? Because I think this is the big meta issue that is going to tie and bind all of the issues this year.
So I was thinking that because tech and social media were in my thoughts for this year. And I thought, oh, well, I think I said that for 2021 and I don't want to repeat myself. But I think there are a few different things going on right now. And I think that they have to do with social media. And then I think they have to do with splinter tech, if not necessarily splinter net. in a couple senses. I think that in 2021, what I had my eye on was this question that you mentioned of regulation, of tech regulation and social media regulation, because there was beginning to be really a sort of upsurge of public awareness of not just I think not just the impact, but also the lack of accountability of the tech giants. And I think that's only gathered momentum with since Elon Musk purchased Twitter. And this will, I think, come up later as another theme with this question of the return of the super empowered individual that was talked about a lot in the 2000s. I think, though, that I don't think that's going anywhere. I think, if anything, that will be even more the case. But my thinking now in terms of tech and social media is that it will become as much a cultural movement or phenomenon as a political or regulatory phenomenon. And by that I mean that sort of the parallel I would draw is to the late 1960s, early 1970s, the Back to the Land movement, when there was the sort of beginnings of an awareness of the environmental damage, the cultural damage, and the social damage that advanced industrial economies did to all those things. And I think that what we might start to see is a real shift by people in terms of how they live their lives. I don't think in the same way that the Back to Land movement necessarily ended industrialization, but it certainly 30, 40 years later, I mean, there are a lot of vestiges of it, whether it's the environmental movement, the green movement, the move to decarbonize the economy, other things like veganism and vegetarianism, which even in the past 20, 30 years have accelerated enormously. So I think we might see things like people choosing not to use social media, people choosing not to use the internet, people choosing to use typewriters, and snail mail might make a comeback in the same way that vinyl LPs have, and a lot of analog technologies. And so I think that we might find that some of our friends might be harder to reach than they have been over the past decade or so, and that these sort of leaps and bounds in terms of connectivity and ease of communication might start reversing, again, not on a mass scale, but I think we might see little pockets like that emerging where people start calling into question, do I need my cell phone turned on all day long? Or maybe I can leave it off and just check it every 5-6 hours. Do I need 12 different messaging apps, or can I get by with just one? So I think we're going to see a little bit of that in the next year, kind of taking shape as part of other social movements. And then, unless we want to stop there, I think in terms of the splinter net, I think that we're going to see a lot of movement and turbulence with regard to not necessarily splinter net, although it might come to that, but splinter tech and splinter apps. So TikTok might be less accessible in various jurisdictions and other things like that. But also we see with like the U.S. export controls on China in terms of high-tech equipment, that there's going to be probably a bifurcation in terms of tech innovation and availability, which I can't imagine won't have consequences in terms of a two-tier or a two-speed tech ecosystem in terms of globalized ecosystem that we had gotten used to. So in terms of tech, that's where my thinking is, and I don't know. It's more zeitgeist than any particular data or science, but that's sort of where I see things.
But take your discussion of the splinter net and then to perhaps broaden it, the trends that you've been observing now for the last several years. That, as you said, we're not going to stop, but things may get reshaped. And just thinking about globalization in general, you did a great essay for us wearing my Orbis hat here for us in Orbis on globalization. But we are seeing kind of a fracturing, decoupling, and recoupling in different ways, whether it's Europe in particular with this radical decoupling from Russia that 3 years ago everyone said was impossible. Europe was interdependent with Russia, energy and other things, and this decoupling is happening. The attempts to shift supply chains to not have them run through China, and in turn, Russia, Iran, other countries looking to find ways to bypass or route around the dollar and the United States as the linchpin of the global economy. So does this notion of the splinter net, as we discussed, does this also tie into sort of larger trends that you're seeing, that instead of speaking about a single world, we may speak of several world systems, whether in economics or science or communications or tech, that will then have to learn how to collaborate or connect with each other?
So just kind of referring back to that article that you were kind enough to invite me to write. A lot of times when you talk about decoupling or deglobalization, people say, well, that's not happening. You know, if you look at the trade data, if you look at the supply chain data, even if trade makes up a smaller amount of growth and the global economy than it used to, it's still robust, it's still interdependent, and that this talk of deglobalization and decoupling is just that, it's talk. And the point that I argued and tried to make with that article is that globalization, that's a very narrow definition of what we thought about globalization 15, 20 years ago, which was really, this excitement about an accessibility, the world becoming really accessible across jurisdictions and across boundaries, and technology and communication technology was a big part of that. Trade was obviously a big part of that, but travel was as well. The kind of cross-pollination of various national cinemas and film industries and music and things like that. And I do think that I don't think that the next generation is going to be growing up with the same mental map of the world that the generation that grew up in the past 20 years did, where it might have been utopian to expect boundaries to disappear, but they certainly had I think a smaller impact, certainly on people in the developed world, in the global north, in terms of their day-to-day life. Obviously, that can't be said for people in the global south, who still face a lot of restrictions, visa inequalities, and things like that in terms of travel. But certainly for global elites and for the more cosmopolitan classes, and this kind of contributed to the backlash against it. The world was a very different place 15 years ago than it was today. The kind of the idea of what was possible in terms of where one could seek business opportunities and trade opportunities was a lot broader and wider, and more frictionless or less frictionful. So I think, yeah, I don't think there's any question that things have changed dramatically, not only because of the war in Ukraine, predating that. And I think that kind of movement is only going to be driven and fueled by what seems like a really broad acceptance of what even 6 years ago was almost anathema or mind-boggling, this mercantilist approach to trade, where national borders are really important, even if supply chains are still international. And between that and between, I think what you said, Nick, about the war in Ukraine, what it really did was, I think, change what people think is possible in terms of decoupling. That the imaginary around which interdependence was cooked in at this point, and the kind of diversified supply chains are cooked in. I don't think anyone believes that anymore. I mean, I just saw an amazing graphic the other day. It was a time-lapse graphic of Germany's imports of Russian gas. and it's just mind-boggling, because it turns on its head the discussion of what was thought possible even in February 2022, right?
Yeah.
And Germany essentially imports zero Russian gas right now. And so once that becomes possible, you start looking for other opportunities or places where it can be applied. And I think the move to start applying it becomes a little shorter and shorter each time, or the delay in applying it. It's not so much when all you have is a hammer, everything you see, all you see is nails, so much as when you realize that a hammer works, you start looking for other nails. And so I think that people are, policymakers have already started that, and then I think the danger becomes, where do you stop, right? And that the Inflation Reduction Act and the tensions that has created with Europe and the EU are a great case in point, where if it's good to sort of promote U.S. businesses over Chinese businesses, and start turning toward embracing industrial policy, well, European businesses might be the collateral damage. They're not going to be that happy about that, and then where does it go from there? So I think those are the real sort of dangers that we see in terms of this, and it's that temptation that's been made a lot more compelling and stronger by the events of the past year, that I think are the real danger.
One of the other things that you mentioned in the past that I think ties into this conversation of protectionism and trade barriers is you mentioned that in 2022 that there was a very negative view of China that had grown, and then recently you talked about this groupthink especially in Washington D.C. that is anti-China, and maybe that hammering of China is not a good thing, and I want to talk about that, because I think it's a new way of talking about China that that many people aren't discussing, that maybe it's not all bad, and our relationship could potentially we need more reflection on that, on the opportunities, that it's not all a negative game.
So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I know I'm not the only one, and I'm not the first. I mentioned recently people like Ali Wine and Jessica Chen Weiss have been, and I think at some risk in terms of the sort of marketplace for ideas in DC, been really iconoclastic on this sort of march to a China hawk position, and really trying to say, wait, slow down. And both of them have been doing it in their own ways. Ali has written for us in the past, and what he said basically is like, even if we want to compete with China, that's not how we should define U.S. foreign policy. U.S. foreign policy should not be reactive to China. It should not only be a competition with China or trying to counter China's advances. It should be based on what's America's strengths, like what can we do and what can we offer that people want. And there's, I think, very clearly a great demand left for U.S. leadership, especially U.S. trade and trade deals, which I think the Biden administration has ruled out in somewhat short-sightedly. I think what I'm trying to say is going even a step further, because and I think I need to preface it with the caveat that yes, China is problematic. The Chinese Communist Party is authoritarian dictatorship. The repression in Xinjiang and across the country is horrific. The move during Xi Jinping's leadership toward a more repressive, more closed off China, and a more ideologically driven China is clearly a disappointment and a reversal of what people were hoping and maybe somewhat expecting. So I think that's all very clear, and I think that the U.S. does need to respond to that. Europe does need to respond to that by taking stronger measures, by protecting themselves when it comes to strategic supply chains and things like that, diversifying. But I think that in the recognition of that things were going in a direction that were that were belying the policy agenda in Washington, or countercurrent to the policy agenda, and that something needed to change. I think there's been a rush to say everything about the past 20 years has been a mistake, and that it's been a mistake committed by US governments and European governments. And I think that, first of all, that there needs to be a real, and also that everything that's gone wrong in the past 20 years has been a result of China. And I think that is really dangerous. First of all, in terms of the US, the decline in America's relative power, the US contributed a lot to that. 20-year wars in Afghanistan, and maybe a 10 or 15-year one in Iraq, a squandering of goodwill, a squandering of that kind of unipolar dominance that the United States had, the global financial crisis, the sort of casino economy that was favored, the enforcement of the Washington Consensus and neoliberalism on developing countries that had their own ideas for how to address inequalities and poverty, most notably in South America and Latin America. So I think that that blaming everything on China is a mistake. I think also saying that everything about bringing China into the global economy and China's rise is a mistake, has been a mistake, is also very dangerous. First of all, irregardless of geopolitics, hundreds of millions of Chinese brought out of poverty is a good. That's a good for China, it's a good for humanity, it's a good for the world. Beyond that, the impact that China has had in the developing world in terms of infrastructure investment, development, trade, demand for commodities, it's been imbalanced. At times it might have been predatory, but the benefits that it's accrued to South American countries, African countries, Southeast Asian countries, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of economic development, in terms of infrastructure, they can't be denied. And they happened at a time when the US and Europe increasingly turned their back on development aid, on ways that the developing world could be helped beyond simply the Washington Consensus and structural adjustments and things of that nature. So I think there's that as well. I think the idea of a world where the US and Europe dominate and have as much of a wealth and power inequality as they did beginning in 2000 is just fundamentally unjust. And I don't think that should be anyone's goal. And so I think, and we can get into this more, I think there are real opportunities right now. I think that there was a time for a reset of how we approach China and address China. I think that this idea of containing China, of trying to make countries choose between the US and China or the West and China is a real mistake, short-sighted, doesn't play to our strengths. And I think between that and the things like the industrial policy, the IRA, some of the measures that Europe has taken, the border tax on carbon border tax, things like that, they go against everything that the US and Europe have been trying to create in terms of the global order, a liberal global order where there's more integrated economy and things like that. So I think there's going to be more and more of a disjuncture between the US values and the US value proposition. And then we could talk about it more because in terms of what I see a sort of rebalancing and reconfiguration taking shape between the global North and the global South, I think that that creates opportunities for the U.S. and the West, but not if they play it as they have in the past year or so or more of competing with China in ways that then divide the West, competing with China in ways that then force other countries to make binary choices that they don't want to make. And demonizing China in ways that doesn't resonate. If you talk to populations in governments and publics in Africa, for instance, there's a much more nuanced view of China's role in Africa than it's portrayed and perceived in Washington. So to my mind, that's what I mean when I say that that we need a much more balanced and nuanced discussion of China to recognize and call out where there are problems, but to not go so overboard that we blind ourselves to where there are opportunities, and also where we dismiss very clear gains. I think that without China's rise over the past 20 years, the world would be monumentally worse off, including Western populations, but especially in the developed world and elsewhere.
Well, I think that this, calls to a point that, the world is going through this shift, that we have new centers of economic gravity developing, and really, again, calling not for a reactive approach on the part of the United States and Europe, but an active approach. And we had on the doorstep 2 years back, we had Ambassador Charles Ray talking about the importance of thinking about Africa not as a set of problems to be solved, but as a set of opportunities, whether it means the green energy transition, which is going to rely on minerals and commodities from Africa, but also Africa as the workshop, the demographic workshop, where you have a labor force that can, shift some of these supply chains, make them more compact. So I think this really does speak to a change in thinking, and gets back to your point about the mental maps changing about how we in the West, and particularly in the United States, are viewing the world. But Tatiana, to turn it back over to you.
I just, since we're on Africa, you tweeted, the only thing worse than the US ignoring you is the US paying very close attention. This is related to Africa. Can you explain that? Because I just love that tweet, and I wanted to talk about that.
Well, yeah, I started out by saying my thoughts and prayers are with Africa and Africans, because the Africa is the future trope has become widely recognized as a reality in Washington, D.C. And tongue in cheek, the US has a lot to offer. But the US, I don't want to generalize too much and be too critical or harsh. I think the US foreign policy establishment, both within government and in the Washington, D.C. ecosystem, really does see the world through a US-centric prism in ways that reduce the world to US interests. And so it's kind of similar to what I just said about strategic competition with China in Africa. When the US starts paying too close attention, again, that whole hammer and nails thing, we start looking for nails everywhere. And Africa is such a diverse continent, with so many different economies and different regions, different political cultures, that any attempt to generalize is bound for failure. The good thing is that the Biden administration has one of the top Africa analysts as the Africa point person on the National Security Council, whose name I want to say Judd Devermont, but I often confuse his last name, so I might have to sneak off to Google his last name. And one of the things that he worked on when he was still with, I believe, CSIS, was city to city partnerships with Africa. So I don't want to be too overly critical, but again, when you project outward 50 years from now, in terms of demographics, there's everyone knows Europe, Asia, the US, a little less because of immigration, but we'll see how that goes, are going to be aging societies, where they're going to be smaller and smaller active workforces, trying to support larger and larger retired workforces of elders who are living longer and longer, with healthcare becoming better and better, but more and more expensive. It's not a great recipe for sustainable economic development in the West, at a time when the world is becoming more competitive, right? So, and what do we have? We have Europe just doing everything it can to shut down immigration from Africa. We have the US doing the same for South America, for Latin America, and Africans that are trying to come through the Americas now to the US, which is a relatively new phenomenon. And so I think there are two things going on. One is, I think there's going to be a real rethinking of that a generation from now, and a real competition for African immigrants, but not just African immigrants, immigrants from Africa, but not just from Africa. But in the meantime, I think that again, African countries are going to start leveraging that and other things to their advantage. And you know, we've seen a start of that with the loss and damage fund that came out of the COP27 climate change conference in Egypt, where there was a very clear balance of power that tilted against the US and Europe in ways that made it untenable to hold out against those payments. Now, they were framed as something other than reparations in order to avoid any legal responsibility. But that kind of wealth transfer, the door has been open to that. And I think we're going to see more of that. We have an article lined up for today on a similar movement for reparations for slavery and colonization by Mohammed El-Naim. That argues that kind of global fund to transfer wealth, even if it's not as reparations, is where we'll see that movement go in the future, with probably more practical results. So I think that you know, Africa stands to benefit from all of that. It stands to be the worst victim of climate change. But if there is a real meaningful wealth transfer of wealth and technology for loss and damage, but also for mitigation and adaptation, it stands to benefit from that. And other transfers of wealth and other shifts in the global economy. So you know, I think saying, you know, I think that Africa has a real strong hand to play to mitigate against the typical US approach in engaging with Africa that might otherwise be, like I said, cause for concern in that post on Twitter. But I think that Africa has a real strong hand to play, and now it remains to be seen whether it will play it. But I do think that Africa and the developing world in general has a very strong hand to play.
Nick, I want to mention one of your concerns over the last 2 years has been this kind of the Biden-Harris administration operating at the margins, that they can't really push their agenda through. You know, there was a big national strategy review. They kind of took down the whole world. We're going to do 20 million different things. But what is really possible? And what is really possible after, wow, 15 votes to get a Speaker of the House? What is going to be possible in these next 2 years, where I think we're going to start to see, God, is it time for another US presidential election? You know, we talked a lot, you know, over the last few moments with Judah about the potential and everything we have to do. Can we actually do it?
I think I agree with what Judah's been saying here, and with another one of our doorstep guests and friends with Ali Wine. The US seems to be locked into a reactive mode, and proactive measures require the ability to legislate, to set up programs, gasp, appropriate funds, and create programs. And if you have deadlock, and if you have a Congress which can't pass budgets but do continuing resolutions and hasn't coalesced around a positive vision of what the US should be doing in the world, I don't know that we can move forward. And then, you know, Judah, does this leave the initiative of China, of India, of the European Union? It really becomes an open question of, I think, as you said, people want the US involved, they want the US engaged, but, you know, is US domestic politics going to be the rock on which these aspirations are going to founder? And I don't have a clear answer to that. Judah, from your perspective as, you know, editor of World Politics Review, and also, you know, being able to observe this from the outside, you know, what are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Well, I'd say with regard to U.S. domestic politics, it's been pretty astonishing how successful the first couple of years of Biden's presidency have been in terms of pretty monumental legislation that's come out of those first 2 years. I feel like in some ways, if there's been less, and also in fairness, Biden came into office similar to Obama with a lot of cleanup and a lot of repair work to do to crucial relationships, especially in Europe, but also Asia and things like that. And also US democracy in the aftermath of the Capitol riot. So I feel like there were some limitations in terms of how ambitious his global agenda could be in terms of foreign policy, but I think a lot of the constraints have been self-imposed by the so-called foreign policy for the middle class, this allergy to trade deals and liberalized trade, which is what Southeast Asia, countries in the Americas, Africa as well, would really value and have increasingly come to see as sort of gauges of US seriousness in terms of engagement. So there's been that as a constraint. I think also there's been a real hesitation to undo some of the leverage points that the Trump administration did accumulate, whether it's with China, but also with Iran. And for better and worse, I think in that case, I think politically it would not have been a good look for Biden to immediately re-enter the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, at all costs, or to immediately unilaterally remove US trade tariffs on China. Was he ambitious or energetic enough in trying to get some of that stuff moved more quickly? I don't think so. With China, I think also he was getting some advice from people who are very sound in terms of Asia policy and China policy, but probably a little more hawkish than I would have been in terms of that. So I think there has been some self-imposed modesty or limited ambitions by the Biden administration in terms of action. And then I guess the dichotomy is, I think, as you said, Nick, and also you, Tatiana, is that when you look at the declarative policy in terms of the strategy documents and everything, I mean, it's everything everywhere. There's no trade-offs at all. There's no means to ends measurements or configuration or calibration. The U.S. has to be all things in all places, and that obviously doesn't work, and it can't work. I think with regard to the interaction between U.S. domestic policy and foreign policy, the advantage Biden has is that the US president does have a wider range on foreign policy than in domestic policy. The disadvantage that you mentioned, Nick, is that he needs money to do a lot of things, and without Congress functioning and functioning in a way that's realistic in terms of funding some of these programs, I don't think necessarily that he'll have a lot of leeway to do so. You know, I think also one last thing I'd say is that where there is a real consensus, for the most part, it's on maintaining military support for Ukraine, on replenishing US stocks of munitions and rearming the US military, refocusing the US military on big war, conventional war after the counterinsurgency decades. And I think there's more and more calls in Europe. We see Germany commit more to defense funding. Japan just committed more to funding their defense. I think that's important. But again, there's a limited amount of resources, and I think you know, Tatiana, you mentioned how the pandemic is still with us. I'd say the pandemic is with us, but in a different way. I think we're in the long COVID stage of the pandemic, where all the things that were talked about in March 2020, Build Back Better, the debt that's owed to the younger generation that suffered and sacrificed so much in that year. How to make things more sustainable, how to make sure this global South doesn't suffer the way it did. Where's that in all of this, and in a period of inflation and what have you? So I think that that bigger chunk that defense spending is going to take, or seems likely to take, out of domestic spending is going to be contested. There's going to be a lot of social movements and social agitation for putting that money to use elsewhere, in ways that could make that problematic. So I think that too is something that will have an impact on U.S. foreign policy. There's money. The budget is going to be increasingly contested, and not just by dysfunction in Washington, by social movements in the U.S. that are demanding more of that.
So, that leaves a lot of questions about where the U.S. is going to be in the world, and what is going to happen in 2023. And I want to ask you, what one or two stories are you looking at this year that you think might not have been covered enough in 2022? Let me share mine. I think India. I think it's all about India. I think we haven't talked enough about India. I think the next few years, it's going to be all about India. I look from the ground up. Here in America, we have this phenomenon called the American Girl doll. I don't know if you've heard about it, Judah. But
Not
this
yet, no.
year's American Girl doll is an Indian American doll. And I really do think that tells us something from the ground up, that there is more of this appetite to learn more about India, to study, and also from the top down, India's influence in the world that needs to be closer looked at. So that's my big story for 2023. What about you?
Well, I think we definitely talked about a few of the themes that I'm looking at. I'm focusing less on particular countries and more on bigger trends, I guess. And we talked a lot about it, about various things like what I expect to be a shift in the power balance between the global North and the global South. I think what I'm keeping my eye out for, and I don't know that I'm keeping my eye out for, I think that the narrative that we've seen over the past couple of years of democracy versus autocracy is going to shift dramatically. I think we're in a period right now where we're seeing a real exhaustion of all the models, the proposed models for governance. I think that democracy has shown some wear and tear in the U.S., Brazil, Eastern Europe, El Salvador, even in India, in that sense. But autocracy hasn't been doing too well either, right? Whether it's in Iran or in China more recently, Russia. And so I think that we're going to be seeing a lot more creative solutions being offered, both on a sort of bird's eye level, similar to what I mentioned about reparations and loss and damage, ways of repairing and restoring some equity to the global relationships, but also from the ground up in terms of social movements. During the pandemic, the state really demonstrated, or the pandemic demonstrated that there's still a role for the state in terms of interventions, and that when the state wants to do something, it can. I think that comes on the heels of a lot of questioning of the neoliberal Washington consensus and things like that. I don't think necessarily state capitalism in a Chinese model or a Russian model necessarily works any better. And so I think that we might be in a period of history, and I think as some of the backlashes in terms of nationalism or illiberal democracy in Eastern Europe, they haven't worked out that well either. So I think we're in a period where the field has been leveled in terms of the competition for governance models. and in a way that creates more opportunities for new ideas to move from the margins to becoming more respectable and part of the more conventional mainstream discussion. I don't necessarily know what those are, but I feel like we might be really surprised in the next year or two or three by where things come from and how our discussions don't resemble what they did a year ago, and how we're discussing things very seriously that a year or two ago would have been considered fringe or crank, for the better and worse, right? Decoupling with China was a fringe argument 4 or 5 years ago. Now it's gaining some momentum, but I think more creative bubbling up from the ground up of ways of making democracy more responsive, of making the global economy and national economies more just and more equitable. I think we'll see stuff like that. Whether or not it will have an impact, whether or not it will gain traction, I don't know. But I do think we're going to see things like that bubbling up in ways that, again, even if they don't overturn everything that we've come to take for granted, will add things that can have a meaningful impact. So I think that's sort of keeping an eye out for, maybe due to wishful thinking and optimism, but I do think that there is some power to that.
Well, we'd love to have you back in 2024 to see what happened over the past year and if that came true.
All right. Well, I'll be taking notes over the next 12 months so that I can discuss some of it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Judah.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great pleasure as always.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.